I can remember in the 1980s going to McGill, and at that time, apartheid was a major issue. And we should let everybody listening and watching know what the apartheid state was exactly, so we get that clear. But there was immense pressure, especially from the more radical end of the political belief spectrum, to divest any investment in South Africa, to put pressure on the government to dispense with apartheid. And I watched that and I thought, well, apartheid's a pretty brutal regime and it has its marked catastrophic disadvantages, but you bloody radicals, you're messing with things you don't understand and you're virtue signaling like mad, and you're not going to have to bear the consequences of your idiot interference. Because I figured, and I still do, that the most likely outcome for South Africa is that because of the vast disparities in population size and distribution of wealth, is that the white South Africans are going to find themselves in serious trouble. Now, that already happened in Zimbabwe, right? That already happened in Rhodesia, and we haven't talked about the relationship between those states and South Africa at all yet, but we might. But like, the most likely pathway forward is the one that requires the least intelligence and effort, right? Because there's way more ways for things to deteriorate than for them to improve. Like, there's like one way for them to improve and a million ways for them to go wrong. And the wealth disparity in South Africa is a major, major problem, like a massive problem. And that has to do with land ownership as well. And so it seems to me that there's great danger, at least, in that as an outcome. And now I've watched, especially in the last few years, because let's say for the 35 years since the 1980s, I don't remember exactly when the apartheid state disintegrated. When was
1990 was when it ended.
1990.
94
so we're
was
basically
when the ANC
35
took
years
power.
away from that. And so things maintained a somewhat stable equilibrium until 5 years ago. So, is that about right?
Let me just say something about the dismantling of the apartheid system. By the end of the system, initially it started out as an attempt to deal with these this complex dynamics that we've been discussing. And the broad idea was, let's give everyone homelands. We have a strong central government to keep everyone in check, and then the different nations have their own homelands. And that sounds great, but in practice it's not quite that applicable, especially when you still have a strong central government that sort of manages everything. But by the 80s, the Afrikaner people knew this is not working. We need to change. What
was the relationship between the apartheid state per se and this notion of separate homelands exactly? So there were nations or states set up like a federation, essentially, and they were racially or ethnically or both. Like, how are the states configured?
More culturally. So the argument was that South Africa should be thought of as Europe, which I don't think is a bad argument, because the point is it's a big piece of land that's very diverse.
Right.
And how do we deal with that? And the solution to Europe is not have one big European government.
Yeah, well, we've seen where that goes.
Exactly. So the solution must be some form of decentralization. But the way to do that, they thought, was to have one big centralized government that sort of manages the decentralization. And then, of course, there were all these laws that were implemented. And it was also during the time of the Cold War. So they had the Suppression of Communism Act, which said that if you promote communism, it's a crime, and you're going to be prosecuted.
Yeah, well, the whole suppressing communism thing is a very complex rabbit hole as well. It's
exactly.
Like the communists turn out to be quite a lot of trouble, especially in places where there's a lot of wealth disparity.
Yeah, the concerns about the threat of communism wasn't exaggerated. That's certainly
It's hard to exaggerate the threat of communism.
Yes.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Especially in parallel with wealth disparity, because it's a revolutionary ethos.
Exactly.
And one that results in nothing but bloody, brutal murder and mayhem, starvation. Like, as a solution to the problem of disparity of wealth, it's not a good one.
Yeah.
So
the point I want to make is, by the end of the apartheid era, the metaphor that was used was like riding on the back of a tiger and having to get off. You have to get off this tiger. But the question is, how do you get off without getting eaten? That was the question that at least the Afrikaner people were grappling with. How do we end this in a way that is peaceful and in a way that would not
and sustainable?
Yes. And it was the transition, I would say, was at least peaceful, fairly. I think
not bad.
The violence in townships, I think, is underestimated, but especially black-on-black violence in South Africa.
Tell people what the townships were and are.
So that's it's urbanized areas that are very poor in South Africa, where the majority of black people live. And at the time, there was some very, very vicious rival warfare, you could say, between competing political groups who were competing for support of black people, as if that's one whole. And the ANC, who's currently governing, was not the biggest initially, but they became the biggest because they were supported by the Soviet Union and the Chinese, and they got weapons and so forth.
Well, in terms of getting off a tiger, things went not too bad. Like it could have been, as apartheid fell apart, it could have been like the fall of the Soviet Union. It could have been a lot worse. It's quite the miracle that it wasn't just absolute bloody mayhem immediately. And, there were a lot of remarkable people who took leadership at that point to make sure that it did go well,
Nelson
quite
Mandela
miraculously all things considered.
Nelson Mandela probably being the prime example of someone who continually called for peaceful solutions, and he was criticized by that within his own within his own party. But I think to use, you mentioned safe but also sustainable. So the solution we got was a safe one, but not sustainable.
Okay, well, walk through that. Tell everybody what has unfolded and what the current situation is.
Well, there's so much that has unfolded, but one way to think of it is that in terms of, the way I put it is, we have two problems. The one is the ship is headed in the wrong direction. And what I mean by that is those in power openly say they want to implement socialist solutions. They want to take property rights. They think the way to help to uplift the poor is to attack the rich, because that has happened. There are many examples.
Right. Well, and let's rephrase that a bit. There's a difference between rich and productive, right?
Yes.
Productive people have something for themselves, but they produce a lot for other people. And from what I understand about, I think this is true in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, and South Africa, it's like, the South African farmers, they feed the country.
Yeah.
So if you do what was done in Zimbabwe and you confiscate the land because the rich people own it, the oppressors, you confiscate the land, then what happens? Well, everyone starves to death. Then everyone's equal because they're all 6 feet underground.
Exactly.
Yeah. So like the problem, part of the problem we have in the West is the language has been captured so completely by the left that it's almost impossible to have a discussion like this without using their terms. Like most pro-free market people in the West talk about capitalism.
Yeah.
That's a really bad idea. It's like, it's not capitalism. It's free market.
I agree.
And it's not the rich versus the poor exactly in South Africa, as if the rich only have what they have because they took it from the poor. It's like, no, the South African farmers, most of whom are white, actually know how to farm.
They're some of the best farmers in the world. So one way they did this, which is...
They were Dutch, a lot of them. And you look at what the Dutch do in Europe.
I think the Dutch are probably the best, I think productively the best farmers.
They are. That's their status in the European West.
Yes.
Right. So go Dutch farmers.
Yes.
So they're rich because they make stuff.
If you've listened to us for a while, you know our stance on fluoridation. Today, more than 70% of the US population has fluoride added to their water sources. That is a violation of personal rights, plain and simple. On the Jordan Peterson podcast, you've heard how governments have no problem with mass medicating their populations without consent. On this show, we refuse to drink compromised water. That's why we use Cove Pure. Cove Pure is a countertop reverse osmosis system that filters your water in 4 stages, stripping away fluoride, contaminants, and the arrogance of bureaucrats who think they know what's best for you. Their clear wave reverse osmosis technology is lab certified to remove up to 99% of impurities, leaving you with only the purest water possible. And unlike the government, Cove Pure lets you have your water exactly the way you want it. It has a simple touchscreen that lets you choose the exact amount or temperature that you want. Hot, cold, warm, whatever. Cove Pure does it all instantly with the tap of a button. Not only does it look amazing, the best part is that there's no need to drill into pipes or call a plumber. You just set up Cove Pure right on your countertop, fill it up with water, and plug it in. Your health shouldn't come at the cost of your autonomy. Purify your water today with the same system that Jordan uses. And because we've partnered with Cove Pure, you'll get $200 off if you use our link in the description box, covepure.com/Jordan.
So one thing they did, which is very smart and very strategic, is the ANC, when they took power, they said the single biggest problem in South Africa is a triangle. It's a triangle of unemployment, poverty, and inequality.
Yeah.
And so they lump those three things together. And so the solution is to find, or the quest is to find a solution for these three things, which is essentially the same thing. But unfortunately, they don't seem to know how to encourage production. They don't know how to fix the unemployment problem because they think the solution is socialism.
Yeah.
And so the way, ironically, they've gotten to a point where they can only think about inequality. Mm-hmm. And so they get Margaret Thatcher at that famous line saying, you would rather have the poor be poorer provided that the rich is less rich. And it's that...
there's actually an anthropological theory about human beings that's relevant to that. So, we evolved in our genetically modern form 350,000 years ago. Okay, so one question is, well, what the hell were we doing for the 330,000 years, like before the Ice Age, say? And the answer is, well, we were engaging in nonstop intertribal warfare. And then within our own tribes, every time anybody got something that everyone else didn't have immediately, we just killed them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we had to figure out how to,
We had to figure out how to let some people have more than other people some of the time. Because the alternative solution is, like, imagine a new product comes along, like a flat screen TV. Well, the first people to get the flat screen TV are the billionaires. Mm-hmm. But if you wait 5 years, then everybody gets a flat screen TV.
Or
but
an iPhone.
You have to wait. And so if the socialist idea is something like, well, if a new innovation comes along that makes people wealthy, it can't be implemented until every single person can have exactly the same amount all at once. Well, so it looks to me like the cost of innovation is inequality, because things have to start somewhere. Now, in the West that if you're rich, what does it mean if you're really rich compared to just like middle class? It means your house has exactly the same amenities, but 3 times the square footage. It's like, or your car is more luxurious while you're stuck in the same traffic, right? The incremental difference is it's trivial between middle class and ultra wealthy, and I mean, people might say, well, that's easy for you to say because you're rich. It's like, if you're middle class, you're rich. And if you're too stupid to realize that, you know nothing about the world. Yeah. And so in South Africa, but we know one of the things that promotes violence, like this is absolutely crystal clear from the anthropological, sociological, and psychological literature. Extreme inequality breeds male violence like mad, because low status, poor men have nothing to lose by engaging in mayhem, right? You see this in gang warfare. You see it, so for example, if you look in North America, this is true across the world, places where everyone's poor, there isn't much violence. And places where everyone's rich, there isn't much violence. But places where some people are poor and some people are rich, look the hell out. And South Africa's got that in spades. Yep. And so the easiest solution for a politician, especially an unscrupulous one, is to say, well, you see those people over there in that house? They took it from you. Yep, exactly. That's what the bloody Bolsheviks said to the peasants. And that worked very effectively. It's like soon there were no people who were rich, right? None. And then everyone was dead. Yeah. So, okay, so you guys have this problem in spades, and the communist influence, it's stronger now than it was 40 years ago?
Yes, but also not. So that's the irony. So that goes to the point about the ship I mentioned. So the ship's headed in the wrong direction, but even though the ship is heading in the wrong direction, the ship is sinking. And what I mean by that is
that's a bad combination.
Yes. So the fact that the ship is sinking has become a bigger problem than the fact that it's headed in the wrong direction. And when I say the ship is sinking, I mean that we just have massive state failure in South Africa. So they want to implement all these very radical policy ideas, and they have become more radical because they talk about a 2-phase revolution. Phase 1 is getting control of the levers of power through democracy. And phase 2 is once you have power, you need to use the levers of power to implement your socialist ideas, which is where they are now. So we have this plethora of new, very radical leftist policy ideas in South Africa. But on the one hand, they're not really able to implement this because firstly of large-scale corruption, but just sheer incompetence within the South African government. So every sphere, everything that the government is supposed to be doing in South Africa, with the exception of tax collection, is collapsing.
Okay, tell us what that looks like. Like, can we start with the stability of the power grid? Like, what's the difference between South Africa now as a modern industrialized state and South Africa, say, 10 years ago?
Yep.
What are you seeing fraying? What does it look like in the streets? And
So we can literally take any example, but let's take power as an example. We started having rolling blackouts maybe a decade ago. And it was you would have an hour without electricity because they're not able to provide electricity for everyone because they didn't build power stations.
well, providing electricity for everyone turns out to be very difficult.
Yes.
You better stay on top of it.
So you have to build stations, but you also have to maintain them.
Yeah, right.
And neither of these two are happening. So we're about at, I think the last time I saw, about at half of the capacity we would have been if the power stations were maintained. So
With a massive population increase.
yes, exactly. And so that's one part of the problem. But then, so where we are now, initially, it's the metaphor. Let me say this because I think this is relevant. So Cyril Ramaphosa, who's the president of South Africa now, was the chief negotiator for the ANC during the negotiations for the new South
African
Africa.
National Congress.
That's it, yes. The ruling party. And so one member of parliament who was an opposition member of parliament wrote in his memoirs that he was part of the negotiations, and he asked, during this negotiations, he asked Ramaphosa, who's, as I said, the president at the moment, what's your plan for dealing with the whites? To which he said, well, that's easy. You deal with them like boiling a frog alive. The metaphor, putting the frog in the water and just lifting.
Hear that metaphor a lot nowadays in many places.
Yes, just lifting the temperature gradually, and then the frog doesn't jump out. And so the problem with that is we really see that something gets worse. We hear that we have, for example, 1 hour of rolling blackouts, and everyone complains, and that's fine for a week or a month. And then it's 2 hours, and then it becomes 3 hours.
People can adapt, unbelievably well. And the new normal becomes normal so fast, it's just beyond. Like, I just remember during COVID, it's like 6 months in, it was like, oh, this is how life is. And you just forget about what it was like before. And part of that's a testament to human adaptability, but it's also an indication of the fragility of even our fundamental expectations. Okay, so there's a level of collapse that is slow enough so people won't rise up and and so
now we have times where there are up to 12 hours a day without electricity. And
that's everywhere. And what, people have their own diesel generators? How do you deal with that?
We put up solar powers. So people adapt to that, those who can afford it. You have solar power.
Right, so the richer people still have power.
Exactly. Ironically, making the gap between the rich and the poor bigger.
Well, look, as soon as your infrastructure starts to deteriorate, the poor people, like, people die from the bottom up, right?
Literally, that's actually
And
so water as an example. So we lose about 40, almost 50% of our water as a result of leakages, pipes not being maintained. And the funniest story was in one town, the town didn't have water. And then the municipal manager said, but remember, these pipes were built by the Apartheid government, so we should blame the pipes. So they're not maintaining the pipes, but the fact that they were built by the previous government means that the pipes are the problem. But not maintaining them.
That's right. Well, that's like failure as indication of our moral virtue. That's what the degrowth people have been doing in the West too. We're not economic failures. We're aiming at degrowth, and man, we're hitting the target.
And so we have, that's a good example where, again, people who are more wealthy can make a plan. They dig boreholes or something.
Well, it's the definition of wealth.
Yes.
You're protected from entropy.
And the people who suffer the most are poor black South Africans who live in townships who die from drinking water that is contaminated.
Right. When the water would be even a more crucial issue than power.
Exactly.
Right. They're integral. What else do you see?
We have the transport system, for example. Our railways have collapsed. The port in Durban, in the eastern part of the country, last I read it was number 405, rated number 405 on a list of 405 ports. So the worst one in the world, which is a big deal because you need a well-functioning port for the economy to function. So that's an example.
For people not to die.
Again, the transport, I mentioned that the fact that the roads aren't maintained. And then we have these practical things like policing is more than just practical. So, and once again, an example of the more wealthy people who are able to adapt to that. So we
hire private security.
Exactly. So private security in South Africa is currently double the size of the police and the army combined.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, because the police are. I mean, I was in an
So
army.
that's really a reversion to something like it's quasi-feudal society at that point.
Yes, and then what happens again in poorer communities is they resort to some form of mob justice because the police aren't there. There's a guy who rapes people in your community. Everyone knows who he is, and the police doesn't do anything. So the people deal with him themselves. So you get vigilante justice in South Africa. So that, I mean, we can go down the list. The education system. One poll found that 80% or survey, 80% of the schools in South Africa are dysfunctional. I believe the number is the top 200 schools in South Africa, which are predominantly the more wealthy schools, have more distinctions for children who finish high school than the next 6,000 schools combined. So the education system. And so again, everything, one economist who's a very renowned economist in South Africa, he sort of makes a joke, but it's not just a joke. He says people ask him, where should you invest? What should you do to make money? And he says, it's easy. You should look at what is the government supposed to be doing and invest in something that is in the private sphere that is doing that thing. Whether it's electricity generation, whether it's water, whether it's private security, whether it's private education, those are the areas that are...
So your metaphor was not only is the ship going in the wrong direction, so that's we're going to do more stupid things faster, but the additional complication is that all the evidence is that the whole thing is fraying at the seams and sinking. Right. And that's the most likely trajectory always is the disintegration of a complex and sophisticated industrial society, because those bloody things are impossible to produce and very difficult to maintain. And so now that one of the terrifying things that, you brought up earlier is that, whither goes South Africa, there goes the West. It's just like delayed. And, that's partly why I'm interested in South Africa. It's like, okay, let's not be thinking that couldn't happen here, because that is here for all intents and purposes. It's just on the cutting edge of here. Okay, now your book is entitled Kill the Boer. There's a reason for that. So why don't we delve into that? We've got about 20 minutes left, something like that on this side of the podcast. Let's switch to the cutting edge, let's say, of the revolutionary inclination in South Africa, because I've really noticed, especially in the last 2 years, things have been heating up like mad. I watch X a lot and I follow a lot of South Africans, and I'm starting to see some evidence of the worst of possible outcomes increasingly becoming likely. And so you're obviously concerned about something approximating that. So let's delve into this particular phrase and illustrate for people where that came from and what it means.